Mindfulness is everywhere. It's recommended by psychologists, taught in schools, offered in workshops, and advertised by just about every wellness app. But despite how often we hear that word, I think most people, including many who actually practice it, don't actually know what mindfulness is. Welcome to Psychology Reconsidered. My name is Rihanna, and I'm the host of this podcast. Just as a disclaimer, before we get started with today's episode, this podcast is designed to make psychological science and reputable mental health information more accessible. However, the information shared is for educational purposes only and is not intended to provide therapy, diagnosis, or individualized medical or psychological advice. Today, I want to very broadly unpack what mindfulness actually is, where it comes from, and what the science says, and perhaps most importantly, how you can realistically incorporate it into your daily life. The idea of mindfulness has grown tremendously in our society. We see it being incorporated in mindfulness programs for children and adolescents in schools, in universities, with student wellness initiatives, across healthcare settings such as hospitals, pain clinics, cancer centers, as well as across a variety of professional settings, for instance, stress management and resilience workshops. We also see a lot of it on social media, as well as integrated within the wellness culture. So things like Be Mindful and meditation apps and mindfulness influencers providing a variety of different resources. And while all of these often free and readily accessible resources are great, the idea of mindfulness in today's society has become oversimplified or misunderstood to some extent, and something that we need to be particularly careful of and aware when we are accepting a resource as a mindfulness resource versus not. So to get us started here, I thought I would provide a little bit of a history of where mindfulness came from and how it got integrated into the North American society specifically. So mindfulness has its roots in Buddhist contemplative traditions, dating all the way back to about 2,500 years in India. We know that mindfulness, in fact, actually did exist and had roots in Hindu traditions as well, even before this, about 4,000 years ago. However, Buddhist traditions have more so preserved and developed mindfulness practices most robustly. The concept most closely related to mindfulness is sati, which is a term coming from Pali, which often is translated as awareness or mindful attention. And this term is actually derived from the word sarati, which means to remember. Though our current practices do adopt some of those core elements, including that mindfulness can serve as a guiding principle for daily life, encompassing awareness of body, feelings, thoughts, and surroundings, the way that we understand mindfulness in the context of the Western world is quite different from how it used to be back in the Buddhist religious and cultural upbringings. Mindfulness was originally introduced to the West in the mid-20th century. So we know that teachers such as Thich Nhat Hanh began sharing mindfulness in accessible ways to society and really emphasizing compassion in those daily practices to fulfill that desire to want to live your life in a mindful way. Now, since then, our understanding of mindfulness has significantly shifted, and we often reflect back on the 1970s to really understand where this modern secular rise of mindfulness really came from. So in 1979, an individual by the name of John Kabat-Zinn developed mindfulness-based stress reduction at the University of Massachusetts in the medical center. So his goal there was to adopt these contemplative practices into a secular, evidence-based healthcare intervention, specifically for patients suffering with chronic pain and heightened levels of distress. Since then, mindfulness has become integrated into psychology, medicine, education, and neuroscience, and in fact, a variety of different manuals were later adopted from MBSR, including MBCT, or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for recurrent depression. John Kabat-Zinn defined mindfulness as the awareness that emerges through paying attention on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally to the unfolding experiences moment by moment. So really here, what John was saying is that mindfulness is about the awareness that we cultivate. It's about that intentional paying attention to what is happening in the here and now in a very non-judgmental sense, or from a very non-judgmental perspective. Now, building off of this quote, as more research went into understanding what mindfulness is and it became more popular in our day-to-day lives in the Western world, there are other concepts that people began to highlight as being core concepts of understanding mindfulness. The first being decentering. So that is one of the main pillars to really understand what mindfulness is. So decentering can be understood as, rather than seeing yourself as your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions, what you do instead is you see your thoughts, your feelings, and emotions as mental events that come and go. So it's really all about changing your relationship to your experiences, particularly the negative ones, and really becoming more of an observer of the things that are going on in your life, rather than personalizing them too much and resonating with them at the personal level. So an analogy I like to use is, imagine that you're sitting on the bank of a river. You see the river flowing, and then beside that river, there's a large tree. And as that river flows, there are little leaves that are falling off of the tree and floating right downstream the river. And what you do is you notice each leaf as it passes. However, you don't need to jump into the river and follow every one of those leaves. You choose to just observe them. So this is what we want to try to apply when we talk about being mindful. We want to try to let every leaf pass without holding on to it, without chasing it, without trying to change its trajectory. So a related concept to this is non-judging and acceptance. So allowing things to be as they are, rather than trying to put a positive filter on them, a negative filter on them. We're trying to sustain a very neutral perspective on our thoughts, on our feelings, on our experiences, on our environments. Curiosity is yet another core pillar of mindfulness. And they often say that actually the best practitioners of mindfulness are babies or little children, because they view the world as a new world every day. They view every experience as something new, as something very enticing, as something that has a lot of curiosity rooted in it. And so when we think about mindfulness, we also want to adopt that really curious perspective on life, a very curious perspective on our thoughts, on our feelings, on all the events that occur on a day-to-day basis. And going back to John Kabat-Zinn's quote, it's all about that present moment attention and awareness. So it's really rooted in our ability to stay aware of what's going on around us and within us. And what I mean by around us and within us is becoming observers of the thoughts that are happening within our mind without latching on to each and every one of them. We're simply observing them as they pass. And likewise, the things that are happening outside of our mind and happening outside of our body, the faces that we see, the people that we encounter, the conversations that we have, really being present in each and every moment rather than spending too much time in the past or too much time in the future. Something else I wanted to address is some of the common misconceptions about what mindfulness might be. So the first thing I want to highlight is that mindfulness does not involve emptying your mind altogether. It's a common misconception that people think that in order to practice mindfulness, I just have to stop all of my thoughts. Unfortunately, that is not possible, and that actually is never the goal of mindfulness. What we want to do instead is we want to get really good at identifying what is going on in our mind and becoming really good at broadening our awareness to the processes, to the thoughts, to the feelings, to the emotions that are currently happening in our mind. So it's not about never having thoughts or getting rid of all the bad thoughts. It's never about striving to achieve this sense of calm and serenity. Although sometimes that is an outcome of practicing, that is not the end goal. Like it'd be more so like a byproduct. Rather than getting rid of all the thoughts or feeling extremely calm, we want to actually enhance our ability to sustain attention on something. And by that something, I mean the present moment. Mindfulness is also not about solely thinking positive. Rather, it's about being able to become attuned with whatever we are thinking about, labeling it, and not delving too deep into the thoughts themselves. Because in theory, most of our thoughts are often past focused or future focused. And so we want to get really good at bringing awareness to the present moment and the thoughts that are related to our present moment awareness. So it's all about training our attention. We want to get really good at controlling where our mind goes and specifically bringing our mind to the present moment. Now, you might hear often the term meditation and mindfulness being used interchangeably. And while they are related concepts, there are some very important distinctions between the two. And I'll start by defining what mindfulness is. So mindfulness is a way of being. So like John Kabat-Zinn put, it's paying attention to the present moment. While meditation, on the other end, is a way of training the mind. So it's a more active process. And we can understand meditation as one method to achieving mindfulness. So let's unpack that a little bit further. When we think about meditation, we can view it as a structured exercise that is used to cultivate mindfulness. So it's one of the several ways to practice mindfulness or to develop mindfulness systematically, if you will. And there's actually two forms of meditation that we can have. One is what we call focus attention meditation, which, as the term implies, it's attention anchored on one object at a time. So like your breath, a particular sound, a body sensation. And when the attention wanders or the mind wanders, which it will, you gently redirect it back to the chosen object. So that's focused attention, really selecting something, focusing on that in the present moment, and redirecting your mind back to it when your mind wanders. The other type of meditation is called open monitoring meditation. This is where our awareness is expanded to our thoughts, our emotions, our bodily sensations, and the environment. So what we're doing here is we are observing our experiences without trying to change them. Now let's shift gears to understand mindfulness a little bit more. So mindfulness, once again, it's a quality or way of paying attention. And like with meditation, there are actually two categories of mindfulness practice as well, or mindfulness as a way of being. The first one is formal mindfulness practice, which involves some sort of formal meditative practice. So this is where we are designating a specific time and place to practicing. And that can look very different for everyone. It can include a sitting meditation practice, a body scan, a stretching meditation. And then the other type of mindfulness are informal practices. So these are those moments where we engage in everyday activities with the intention of being mindful. So that could be mindful eating, mindful walking, mindful showering, mindful brushing of the teeth. And sometimes this surprises people that there is such a thing as informal practice, which actually still counts as mindfulness practice. So now that we have a really good idea of what mindfulness is, where it came from, how it differs from meditation, let's talk about, well, how or why does mindfulness work? And I'm going to share some findings based on the benefits reported by researchers and clinicians all over the world, specifically in North America. So research on mindfulness in both clinical and non-clinical samples started to really grow in the 1980s after mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR, was developed. And then in the early 2000s, the field further exploded. And this was around the time that MBCT, or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, was developed and published. And so we can say that in the 2000s, the mindfulness field really skyrocketed. And looking at all the published data, and we have thousands of papers published on mindfulness-based interventions, the evidence is looking really encouraging. Let me share just very general improvements that have been noted in the literature. We know from randomized controlled trials that mindfulness yields improvements in things like low mood, anxiety, increasing individuals' ability for regulating their emotions and tolerating and responding to stress. Sleep has been a noted outcome to improve in the context of mindfulness. Pain, as well as individuals' overall quality of life. The evidence is suggesting that mindfulness can be really helpful for individuals that are relatively healthy, as well as individuals that might be struggling with things like anxiety, with things like depression, chronic pain, insomnia, as well as a variety of different other mental health and physical health ailments. Not only that, but there's evidence to suggest that mindfulness can in fact rewire or restructure our brain. And that is a concept we refer to as neuroplasticity. And so we've seen through, once again, randomized controlled trials and other study designs that there is something called neuroplasticity associated with mindfulness. And specifically, there have been 3 very broad and big networks that have responded to mindfulness. And by responded, I mean have changed at the neuroplasticity level in response to mindfulness interventions. So the 3 networks are, simply put, the salience network, the default mode network, as well as the central executive network. So I'll just briefly summarize what each of these networks are responsible for and how they have responded to mindfulness interventions. So the salience network is responsible for emotions, so emotional reactivity, emotional regulation, or emotional dysregulation. And individuals that engage in regular mindfulness practice actually experience neurobiological changes in areas of the brain that are responsible for those processes. Likewise, the default mode network is the one that is responsible for what we call self-referential processing, or that mind wandering that all of us experience to some extent. And so mindfulness has suggested to quiet our brain a little bit from that perspective as well. So individuals that regularly engage in mindfulness practice have less mind wandering, have reduced rumination, they have better self-awareness and improvement in a variety of the other types of self-referential processes. The central executive network is the one that is responsible for kind of the thinking, the memory, the attention, and other executive functions. And once again, mindfulness has had a neurobiological impact on these areas of the brain as well. And so we're not only talking about self-reported outcomes, we're talking about studies that have implemented neuroimaging to look at impacts of regular mindfulness practice on specific parts of the brain. Super fascinating. And now you might be wondering at this point, well, how is all of this happening, right? And there's a lot of research now looking into the specific mechanisms of how these changes are occurring. And a very common mechanism to explain these changes is that mindfulness has a large impact on individuals' ability to regulate their emotions. So it teaches individuals to respond to events, to thoughts, to feelings, rather than react to them. So it teaches individuals how to create more space between an event, as well as how they choose to respond to that event. There's this greater sense of cultivating acceptance, a perspective of acceptance, those improvements in attentional control we see, and just a general increase in psychological flexibility to allow individuals to take a step back and to decenter from specific thoughts, feelings, emotions, and situations. And so by this point, you might be wondering, how exactly do I integrate mindfulness into my everyday life? Where do I start? And I've put together some very key pointers from, once again, research, as well as from my own personal experience. And the very first and arguably most important thing that I want to say here is that what matters most here is consistency of practice rather than duration. So research has suggested that individuals that practice more frequently for less amount of time actually yield greater benefits than those that practice less frequently but for longer durations of time. Now, as a good starting point, you might want to consider emphasizing those informal practices to start. So it might look like choosing to practice mindfulness every day while you're doing something that you do every day. For instance, brushing teeth, taking a shower, eating, washing your hands. So while you're washing your hands, what you can do is pay attention to the sensation of the warm water hitting your fingers, the smell of the soap that you're using, the sound of the water, as well as any thoughts that might be arising as you are washing your hands. The thing here is that we want to start at 1 minute per day and gradually increase over time. You will be more likely to sustain a mindfulness practice if you start with 1 minute rather than starting at 10 minutes and potentially getting discouraged that you are not getting the results or the feeling or the outcome that you're looking for. Expect your mind to wander. In all of this, we have to acknowledge the fact that we are humans at the end of the day, and our minds wander. That's what minds do. They wander. So the expectation shouldn't be to silence your mind. Rather, it should be to get a better hold of where your mind goes. And what I mean by that is honing in on that skill to bring your mind back to the present when it wanders to the future and or to the past. Let me just give you a little bit of an analogy here. Let's say you're training for a marathon. Nobody will expect to run a marathon on their first day of training, right? We expect our muscles to get tired, and we understand that improvement comes with repetition. And so we want to apply this to mindfulness. In fact, mindfulness is very similar to this. It takes time for us to build our brain muscles to become comfortable with sitting with just the present moment for extended periods of time. We don't do that often, so it takes a little bit of time to practice. And we have to acknowledge that when our minds wander, it doesn't mean we failed. It just means that we've actually just found another opportunity to bring your attention back. Another opportunity to practice bringing your attention back. It will certainly seem effortful at first. However, if you really, really stick with it, it gets easier practice after practice. And once again, the goal isn't to stop thinking. Rather, it's about noticing where your attention has wandered and gently, without judgment, bringing it back. So we really want to limit the expectations that we have going into practice, right? We don't want to be having a very specific end goal or state per se in mind. All we want to do is become comfortable with diverting our attention to the present moment. Now, you might be wondering, how do I know I'm doing it right? Such a common question, such a common experience for everyone when we first start. And unfortunately, there's no black and white answer here. In fact, there actually might not be an answer at all. But let me just try to break it down here. There isn't a perfect mindful state that we're hoping to achieve, right? The goal isn't to stop thinking. The goal isn't relaxation. The practice is simply noticing when you become distracted. So if you're looking for a sign of quote unquote doing it right, that might be the best sign to look for. Being able to notice when you become distracted and gently bring yourself back over and over again. Thank you for listening to Psychology Reconsidered. I hope today's episode on mindfulness gave you something new to think about, a practical insight to take away with you, or perhaps a belief worth reconsidering. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe, leave a rating or a review, and share your thoughts on this episode, as well as provide any suggestions for future episode ideas. Until next time, stay curious, keep asking thoughtful questions, and don't be afraid to reconsider what you think you know.